It was October 1942. Deep in the Pacific, the massive battleship Yamato floated motionless in the dark waters of Truk Lagoon. The night air was heavy with humidity and the faint metallic scent of oil. Inside the Admiral's cabin, a single lamp burned above a table scattered with maps, coded reports, and ashtrays filled with half-smoked cigarettes. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat alone, his back slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the sea through the narrow porthole. Outside, waves whispered against the hull, but inside there was only silence, the kind of silence that carries the weight of realization. Moments earlier, he had received another report from the Solomon Islands. Another convoy sunk, another carrier crippled, another list of names, young pilots, men he had personally trained, now gone. He pressed the paper flat on the desk, smoothing it with a slow hand, as if touch could change the numbers written there. The war, barely 10 months old, was already consuming everything he had built. The victories of the past winter felt distant now, like echoes in a dream, the same dream that had begun at Pearl Harbor. A low murmur came from the radio room, the sound of operators exchanging short bursts of Morse code. Yamamoto reached for his teacup, the porcelain trembling slightly in his grasp. It was cold. He had forgotten it hours ago. He glanced again at the map on the wall. Small red pins marked Japan's territories, Singapore, the Philippines, Rabaul, the Dutch East Indies, each symbolizing triumphs that had once made him a national hero. Yet as he stared, those red marks no longer looked like victories. They looked like wounds spreading across the ocean, bleeding outward. The Admiral leaned back and exhaled. The smell of tobacco and sweat filled the room. He opened a leather folder labeled American Naval Intelligence. Inside were intercepted reports, aerial photos, and translated newspapers from the United States. He scanned one headline, Roosevelt Promises Total Mobilization. Another showed a photo of women in overalls welding steel plates in a California shipyard. Yamamoto's eyes lingered on that image, smiling women sparks flying like fireflies, and he whispered to himself, "They are learning faster than we can kill." He remembered Pearl Harbor, the explosion of flames, the rising black smoke, the triumphant voices of officers on the flagship Akagi shouting that the mission was complete. On that morning in December 1941, Japan had done what no one thought possible, crippled the Pacific Fleet in a single strike. The Emperor himself had praised him. Crowds in Tokyo chanted his name. But now, less than a year later, the same man sat in darkness, realizing that perhaps his greatest triumph had also been his greatest mistake. He reached into his drawer and pulled out an old photograph, Harvard University, 1919. In the picture, a young Yamamoto smiled awkwardly beside a group of American classmates. He could almost hear the jazz music from the Boston bars where he had learned to play poker and where he first tasted American whiskey. Those nights had taught him something no war college ever could, that Americans were not soft or naive, as Tokyo believed. They were restless, inventive, and once provoked, unstoppable. He had warned the government years before, "If I am ordered to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months, but after that, I can promise nothing." The line once quoted with pride now echoed in his mind like a sentence passed on himself. The clock on the bulkhead ticked past midnight. The cabin door creaked open slightly. A junior officer peeked in, hesitated, then saluted. "Admiral, shall I prepare your quarters for rest?" Yamamoto shook his head. "No. Leave me." The door closed. He stood slowly and walked toward the porthole. Outside, the moonlight reflected off the calm lagoon, silver and indifferent. Somewhere beyond that horizon, American factories were working through the night. Somewhere in California, 1,000 new pilots were training. 1,000 ships were being built. The Admiral's reflection stared back at him, tired eyes lined with doubt. He spoke softly, almost to the ocean itself. "We have awakened something far greater than we imagined." He pressed his hand against the glass, feeling the faint vibration of the engines below. "They fight with machines, not with pride. And machines do not tire." He turned away, returning to his desk. On the map of the Pacific, he moved one red pin midway, slightly to the east, toward the abyss. Then he drew a circle around it in pencil and wrote a single word beside it: regret. As he extinguished the lamp, the cabin fell into darkness. The hum of the ship seemed louder now, the sound of a nation still moving forward, unaware that its course had already been set toward ruin. Narrator voice. That night, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood what few in Japan dared to admit. Victory had come too easily and too soon. The enemy he had struck was not a fleet, not even a nation. It was an idea, a relentless machine of industry and resolve, and once awakened, it would never sleep again. If you believe a victory can sometimes be the beginning of defeat, type 1 in the comments. If you think Yamamoto was still right to strike first hit, and don't forget to subscribe for the next episode of WW2 Revelation, where we reveal the hidden night Japan's admirals realized the war was already lost. The sun had barely risen over the Pacific when 6 Japanese aircraft carriers sliced through the water toward Hawaii. It was December 7, 1941, the day that would change the course of history. Aboard the flagship, Akagi Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood silently as the first wave of 183 aircraft took off torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. The pilots saluted, then disappeared into the clouds like arrows loosed into destiny. On another deck, far away, Admiral Yamamoto listened through his headset to the coded message, Tora, Tora, Tora. The mission had begun. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. The harbor erupted in fire and chaos. Battleships moored side by side, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California were hit within minutes. The oil tanks ignited, turning the sky into a black curtain of smoke that could be seen 40 miles away. In less than 2 hours, 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, and 403 Americans killed. The Japanese forces lost only 29 planes. It was, by all tactical measures, a masterpiece of planning and execution. When the first reports reached Tokyo, the nation erupted in celebration. Civilians cheered in the streets. Newspapers printed Yamamoto's name in bold letters, calling him the man who had restored Japan's honor. Even Emperor Hirohito sent personal congratulations. Yet the man they praised sat in his headquarters, listening to the victory reports with no joy. He understood something most of his peers did not. The operation had been flawless, but the strategy behind it was fatally incomplete. From the start, Yamamoto had insisted on a third strike one that would target the American fuel depots, the submarine base, and the ship repair yards at Pearl Harbor. Destroying those facilities would have crippled the U.S. Navy's ability to recover for at least 6 months. But his carrier commander, Admiral Nagumo, fearing American counterattacks, withdrew after the second wave. The fleet turned back toward Japan, leaving the oil tanks untouched. In those massive storage fields sat 4.5 million barrels of fuel, enough to keep the U.S. Pacific Fleet operational for a year. Yamamoto knew it instantly. The heart of America's recovery had been left beating. In the months that followed, the speed of that recovery astonished even the most optimistic American admirals. Within 3 days, the submarine base at Pearl Harbor was functioning again. Within weeks, damaged ships were being patched and towed back into service. By February 1942, 3 of the 8 battleships attacked were already refloated or under repair. And because the aircraft carriers Enterprise Lexington and Saratoga had been away at sea during the attack, America still retained its most vital naval assets, the very ships that would later define the Pacific War. Yamamoto received the early intelligence summaries with growing unease. Each update told the same story: the blow had been powerful, but not fatal. In January, American naval yards in California doubled their output. By March, Roosevelt had announced a national war production plan. Factories once making cars now built aircraft engines and bombers around the clock. Women entered the workforce by the millions. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it, had awakened. At the same time, Japan's victories spread across the map. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies fell in rapid succession. To the generals in Tokyo, this looked like proof of invincibility. But to Yamamoto, the pattern was ominous. Each victory stretched supply lines thinner, while the industrial foundation behind those conquests remained fragile. Japan could conquer territory, but it could not mass-produce the means to hold it. He watched the reports from the shipyards in Kure and Yokosuka with frustration. Japan had launched only one new carrier since Pearl Harbor, while U.S. yards were already laying down 12 hulls of the new Essex-class design, larger, faster, and capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft each. The difference in capacity was staggering. Japan's entire pre-war industrial output was roughly equal to that of the Ford Motor Company alone. By the summer of 1942, the illusion of control began to unravel. The Battle of Coral Sea in May ended with heavy Japanese losses. Then came Midway, June 4, 1942, the turning point. In a single day, 4 of Japan's frontline carriers were destroyed: Akagi, Kagasoryu, and Hiryu. The pilots lost at Midway had trained for years. Their replacements would train for weeks. When the flames from those sinking carriers reached the sky, so too did Japan's last real chance at naval superiority. In Tokyo, the public heard only of a tactical withdrawal. The truth was buried in censorship and silence. But within the Japanese Navy, the scale of disaster was undeniable. Yamamoto spent the following weeks reviewing reports that read like obituaries. Thousands of men gone elite air crews wiped out, the carrier fleet crippled. Every line confirmed what he had feared since December. The United States, with its factories, manpower, and resources, could replace its losses. Japan could not. By August, just 8 months after Pearl Harbor, the balance of power had reversed. American forces landed on Guadalcanal, beginning the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. It was a symbolic moment. The hunted had become the hunter. That same month, Yamamoto received an internal memorandum from Naval Intelligence summarizing American industrial trends. One line struck him like a hammer: estimated U.S. aircraft production. For 1943, 85,000 units. He read it twice, then a third time. In the margins, he wrote only 2 words: impossible. Confirm. But it was true. The brilliance of Pearl Harbor had lasted precisely 8 months. What followed was not just a shift in numbers, but in belief. The Japanese Navy, once driven by the conviction of divine destiny, now whispered doubts behind closed doors. Officers who had shouted banzai now avoided Yamamoto's gaze. They knew what he knew, that the tide of history was turning, and there was no stopping it. In his diary that night, Yamamoto wrote a single sentence: "I wonder how long a nation can fight when its victories taste like fear." Narrator voice: Pearl Harbor had been the spark. But 8 months later, the fire was spreading the other way. Japan's empire was expanding on maps, but collapsing in reality. The machine they had awakened in America was now accelerating, unstoppable, methodical, and fueled not by hatred, but by purpose. If you believe Pearl Harbor was not Japan's greatest victory, but its greatest trap-type one, in the comments. If you think Yamamoto's plan could still have worked with one more strike hit like. And stay tuned for Part 3, where we reveal the devastating numbers that proved to Yamamoto that Japan wasn't fighting a country, it was fighting an entire civilization. By the fall of 1942, Admiral Yamamoto's headquarters at Truk Lagoon had become less a command post and more a confessional of disbelief. Each morning, coded transmissions arrived from Tokyo, lists of losses, ship counts, aircraft deliveries, fuel inventories, and each morning, the numbers sank deeper into absurdity. The empire that had once moved like a blade through the Pacific was now bleeding statistics faster than it could count them. On his desk lay a fresh intelligence summary stamped "Confidential, Combined Fleet Eyes Only." The report came from naval attachés in Stockholm and Lisbon who had intercepted data through neutral shipping channels. It detailed American industrial output for the current year, over 48,000 aircraft, 8 new fleet carriers, 22 escort carriers, 350 destroyers, and nearly 10 million tons of merchant shipping. Yamamoto stared at the figures in silence, his finger tracing each line as though it were a personal accusation. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. He compared it to Japan's own shipyard reports. The contrast was humiliating. Japanese yards in Kure Sasebo and Yokosuka had managed a total of 2 fleet carriers and 4 destroyers in the same period. Even that had come at the cost of exhausting the nation's dwindling supply of steel. Japan's industrial base simply could not compete. It was like watching a nation try to fight an avalanche with a sword. He called for his adjutant, Commander Watanabe, a quiet officer who had served with him since before the war. "Read this," Yamamoto said, sliding the document across the desk. Watanabe studied it for a moment, his expression tightening. "Sir, these numbers cannot be accurate." Yamamoto nodded slowly. "I thought the same. Then I realized, what if they are?" Outside, the sound of aircraft engines echoed over the lagoon as pilots from Shokaku practiced takeoffs. Yamamoto glanced out the window. There were fewer planes, now fewer crews. The veterans from Pearl Harbor were gone dead at Midway or in the Coral Sea. Their replacements were boys, barely 20 years old, trained for a few weeks instead of the years their predecessors had endured. The quality of Japan's air arm had been mortgaged to buy time, and time was something Japan no longer had. The admiral turned back to the map pinned to the wall. Each red circle represented a Japanese base, Rabaul Truk Palau, the Philippines' Java. He drew a blue line stretching eastward across the Pacific to the United States and marked 3 points, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Beneath them he wrote a single word, factories. Then, below that, another word, victory. He remembered his years in America, the endless hum of factories, the railroads that stretched beyond the horizon, the faces of workers leaving shifts at dawn only for others to take their place. He had seen the rhythm of that machine and never forgotten it. That memory, once distant, now returned, as a warning fulfilled. The next report was worse. American aircraft production for 1943 was projected to exceed 85,000 planes. Japanese analysts in Tokyo tried to dismiss it as propaganda, but Yamamoto knew better. Even if the number were exaggerated by half, it was still beyond anything Japan could hope to match. 85,000 aircraft, he whispered. That is not war. That is manufacturing on the scale of nature itself. Watanabe hesitated before asking, "Sir, what should we do?" Yamamoto looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. "We continue fighting, not because we can win, but because we cannot stop." The room fell silent again. He opened another folder, fuel logistics. Japan's tanker fleet had shrunk from 135 vessels before the war to barely 70. American submarines were sinking them faster than they could be replaced. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies had dropped by nearly 40% since January. The entire Japanese Navy now consumed more fuel in 1 month than could be imported in 2. Even the Yamato, his proud flagship, was becoming a prisoner of its own engines, too large to sail without draining the reserves needed for smaller ships. To the admirals in Tokyo, these were inconvenient numbers. To Yamamoto, they were the handwriting of fate. He saw it clearly. The empire was trapped between its ambition and its limitations. That night, he dictated a memorandum to his senior staff, a document so frank that some historians would later call it treasonous. "The enemy's power of replacement," he wrote, "is a weapon we cannot destroy. Each aircraft they lose is reborn within a week. Each ship sunk is replaced before its wreck cools on the ocean floor. We are fighting a hydra whose strength increases as we cut its heads." He paused, then added one final line, "A nation's courage cannot outrun its steel." The next morning, his staff delivered new aerial reconnaissance photos taken by Japanese scouts over Pearl Harbor. What Yamamoto saw in those black and white images chilled him. The harbor that his bombers had left in flames 10 months earlier was now orderly, alive. New cranes towered over dry docks. Half-sunken ships had been raised, their hulls gleaming with fresh paint. Dozens of aircraft sat neatly lined on runways that had once been cratered. Pearl Harbor, the very symbol of American weakness, was now the engine of its revenge. Yamamoto set the photographs down, rubbed his temples, and muttered, "We struck the body, but we left the heart beating." Later that day he attended a staff briefing. Charts filled the walls. Officers argued over strategy, whether to fortify the Solomon Islands to push toward New Guinea or to defend the Central Pacific. Yamamoto listened in silence. The arguments all missed the point. Japan's true enemy was not geography, it was arithmetic. He rose abruptly, interrupting the debate. "Gentlemen," he said, "the question is not where we fight, but how long we can afford to." The room fell still. We once believed the Americans lacked the spirit for a long war. We were wrong. They fight not with spirit but with systems. We cannot break systems with courage. No one replied. No one dared. That evening, as the sun set over Truck Yamamoto stood on the observation deck of the Yamato. The sea was calm, the sky painted in blood-red light. Below him the fleet's silhouettes floated like shadows of a past glory, impressive but fragile. He thought of the American factories again, the ones he had visited 2 decades earlier. He could almost hear the hammering, the roar of engines, the whistle of trains carrying endless supplies. It sounded in his mind like a heartbeat. Narrator voice. By late 1942, Admiral Yamamoto was no longer fighting a naval war. He was fighting mathematics, the cold arithmetic of an industrial nation that could multiply faster than any empire could destroy. Each day, new numbers arrived from across the Pacific, and with each number, the truth grew harder to ignore. Japan's fate was not waiting in some future battle. It was already written in steel and statistics. If you believe wars are decided not by soldiers but by factories, type 1 in the comments. If you still think courage alone can overcome industry, hit like. And stay tuned for part 4, the night Yamamoto finally understood he had attacked the wrong enemy, where the Admiral's realization turns from numbers to conscience. It was late November 1942, and a storm rolled over Truk Lagoon. The rain fell in thin, relentless sheets, drumming against the steel decks of the Yamato. Inside the Admiral's cabin, the sound was steady and hypnotic, like the ticking of a clock, marking down the final hours of an empire. Admiral Yamamoto sat surrounded by maps and reports, but he was no longer studying them. He was staring through them, as if trying to read something deeper beneath the ink and paper. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. "Enter," he said. Commander Watanabe stepped in his uniform, damp from the rain. "Admiral, the officers are assembled in the conference room." Yamamoto nodded and rose slowly. His reflection in the mirror beside the door startled him. For a moment he looked older than he remembered, the sharp lines of his face dulled by exhaustion. In the conference room, 7 officers stood at attention. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken fear. On the table lay the latest battle summaries from Guadalcanal. 2 destroyers sunk, another carrier damaged, hundreds of pilots lost. The mood was not one of strategy, but of post-mortem. Yamamoto began quietly. "Gentlemen," he said, "when I was a young officer, I believed wars were decided by courage. At Tsushima, our Navy won because we fought with heart. I believed the same could be true again." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, but courage is not what wins wars anymore. The men exchanged uneasy looks. Rear Admiral Ugaki cleared his throat. "Sir, we still control vast territories. Our enemies are stretched thin." Yamamoto shook his head. "No, they are concentrated. We are the ones stretched. We fight everywhere and hold nothing." He pointed to the map spread before them. Red flags scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Every one of these outposts bleeds us dry. Every convoy we send to feed them costs fuel. We do not have ships we cannot replace, and men we cannot train again. He picked up a thin folder marked Industrial Capacity Enemy Estimate. "Do you know how many aircraft they will produce next year?" He opened it and read aloud. 85,000, one every 6 minutes. He set it down. That is not an army gentleman, that is a machine. The word hung in the air. A machine, he repeated more softly. That is what we have awakened. Not a nation, not a people, a machine. One that does not sleep, does not hunger, does not fear. Lieutenant Commander Aoki, the youngest at the table, spoke hesitantly. Sir, are you saying we cannot win? Yamamoto did not answer immediately. He poured himself a cup of tea instead, the gesture calm, deliberate. A soldier must never say such words, but a commander must think them. The truth, Aoki, is that we are fighting the wrong kind of enemy. We prepared for a war of men. They are fighting a war of systems. We built an empire of honor. They built an empire of production. Our bullets strike flesh. Theirs strike time itself. No one spoke. The rain outside intensified, drowning out the sound of breathing. Yamamoto's voice lowered to almost a whisper. We believed we could humble America by striking its pride. But pride was never its weakness, it was its fuel. We destroyed their battleships and freed their will. That was our mistake. He turned toward the window where lightning illuminated the lagoon for an instant. Do you remember the Doolittle raid? He asked quietly. 16 bombers that did almost no damage yet shook our entire empire. That was not a military victory. It was psychological. The Americans fight for something invisible, something we cannot destroy. A long silence followed. Some of the officers lowered their eyes, others simply stared at the table. For men raised to believe in divine destiny, doubt was a forbidden emotion, yet here it was spreading through the room like smoke. Yamamoto continued, his tone measured but heavy. Do not misunderstand me. The enemy bleeds as we do. But when their ships sink, new ones rise. When their pilots die, others take their place. Their strength does not come from the individual. It comes from the network that replaces him. We have courage, they have continuity. And continuity in this age is the stronger weapon. He closed the folder and placed his hand on it as though sealing a confession. When we struck Pearl Harbor, we thought we were cutting off the serpent's head. Instead, we cut only its tail. The head, its mind, its will, its machinery was waiting across the ocean, awake and watching. Another flash of lightning filled the room, followed by the slow roll of thunder. Yamamoto looked back at his men. Write this down, he said quietly. History will not remember our victories. It will remember that we learned too late the difference between power and persistence. No one dared to speak. The storm outside seemed to swallow the room whole. For a moment, the only sound was the steady dripping of rainwater through a crack in the ceiling. Yamamoto reached for his cigarette case, but then stopped, his hand trembling slightly. I once believed we could outrun them, he murmured. But how do you outrun an idea? How do you defeat a nation that fights not for survival, but for creation? He turned toward the door. Gentlemen, return to your posts. His voice was flat, now drained of authority. Do your duty. History will decide the rest. As the officers filed out, Watanabe lingered. Sir, he said softly, what should I record in the log for tonight's meeting? Yamamoto looked at him for a long moment. Write that the combined fleet met to discuss victory, he said, and found clarity instead. When he was alone again, Yamamoto stood at the window watching the storm pass over the lagoon. The thunder faded, leaving behind only the rhythmic sound of rain on steel. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, the machine he had awakened was already moving its gears, turning toward inevitable victory. Narrator voice. That night, in the quiet after the storm, Yamamoto finally understood. He had not attacked a navy. He had not even attacked a country. He had struck an organism of industry unity and relentless will. The enemy was not a fleet, it was the future. If you agree that Japan fought the wrong kind of war against the wrong kind of enemy, type 1 in the comments. If you still believe spirit could triumph over machinery, hit like. And subscribe to stay with us for Part 5, The Tragedy of a Genius Alone, where Yamamoto faces not his enemies, but his own nation's blindness. In Tokyo, the war was still being celebrated. Newspapers printed victories that did not exist, and radio broadcasts praised the courage of soldiers who would never return. Posters showed smiling pilots and children waving flags, but behind those smiles was a government desperate to sustain an illusion. Admiral Yamamoto knew that illusion better than anyone because he was the man who had built it. He had once been the symbol of triumph, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who humbled the United States in a single morning. But fame in wartime Japan was a trap. The same public that had cheered him now demanded miracles. The same government that had doubted him before now used his name to feed a dream he no longer believed in. When Yamamoto returned to Tokyo for high-level meetings in early 1943, he found himself surrounded by men who spoke in victories but thought in fear. Generals and ministers sat around long tables in smoke-filled rooms, drawing arrows on maps pretending that strategy could rewrite arithmetic. Every plan ended the same way, with promises that Japan would endure through divine wind and unshakable spirit. Yamamoto remained silent. He had learned that logic had no place in these rooms. One evening, after a particularly hollow meeting, he stayed behind. The others left laughing, their uniforms bright with medals that now felt like ornaments from a vanished age. Yamamoto stood by the window looking down at Tokyo's blacked-out streets. The city was dark, quiet, disciplined, a nation at war with itself as much as with the world. He thought of the people, the workers rationing rice, the mothers sewing uniforms by candlelight, the students training with bamboo spears. They believed the empire would triumph because they were told it must. He envied their certainty. He had not always been a man of doubt. In his youth, he had fought at Tsushima, where Japan's navy destroyed the Russian fleet. It was a victory that shaped a generation, convincing Japan that faith and discipline could overcome any foe. He had believed it too until he went to Harvard. There he had seen another world, cities of light factories that never slept, a nation that turned its abundance into momentum. He had seen a people who argued loudly but moved in the same direction, as if disagreement itself was part of their progress. He remembered long nights in Boston playing poker with American officers. They were loud, careless, and confident, yet underneath their laughter he sensed a power that Japan's solemn discipline could never match, a belief in possibility. Years later, when he visited Detroit, he saw assembly lines stretching farther than the eye could see. He told a fellow officer, "They can build faster than we can imagine. If we fight them, we must win quickly or not at all." No one listened. Now, decades later, those memories haunted him. He had warned that a war with America would be suicide. He had written letter after letter to the Naval Ministry insisting that the United States' industrial strength would overwhelm Japan within 2 years. They ignored him. When the decision for war was made, he had tried to resign. Instead, he was told, "You will lead. Your country needs your genius." So he obeyed. He planned the attack that would shock the world, and it worked too well. Pearl Harbor had transformed him into a national legend, and legends were not allowed to doubt. He became a prisoner of his own success, forced to continue a war he had never wanted. Each victory pushed him further into isolation. Each loss confirmed the prophecy he could never speak aloud. At night he wrote letters to close friends, though he could never send them. A commander, he wrote in one, is a man who must walk between truth and hope. If he tells the truth, he destroys hope. If he gives hope, he betrays truth. I walk that path alone. When reports from the front arrived, destroyers lost pilots killed. He no longer saw numbers. He saw faces. He had met many of those young men before the war, shaking their hands, congratulating them on their training. Now their names appeared in neat columns marked missing. In a navy built on obedience, no one asked why they were dying. They simply died. His subordinates tried to protect him from despair. They brought optimistic briefings, reports of temporary setbacks, promises that new strategies would turn the tide. He thanked them, nodded, and returned to his quarters. There, away from the eyes of his officers, he allowed himself a rare honesty. Sitting at his desk, he whispered to the empty room, "We are not fighting the Americans anymore. We are fighting time." The irony was cruel. In a nation that worshipped sacrifice, the man who understood the cost of war was forbidden to speak of it. He had become an outsider inside his own command. Younger officers admired him, but they also feared him. To question the war was to question the emperor, and no one dared cross that line. Only Yamamoto had seen enough of the world to know that loyalty without reason leads only to ruin. One evening, aboard the Yamato commander, Watanabe found him alone, staring at an old American newspaper clipping pinned to his wall. It showed a photograph of the Ford River Rouge plant, thousands of workers assembling aircraft engines. Beneath it, Yamamoto had written a single sentence in Japanese, "This is why we cannot win." Watanabe hesitated before asking, "Sir, do you ever regret Pearl Harbor?" Yamamoto did not answer immediately. Then he said quietly, "A commander does not have the luxury of regret, only clarity. Regret is for those who can forget." He looked out over the dark sea where distant flashes of lightning illuminated the horizon. "They call me a genius," he murmured, "but genius means nothing if no one listens." Narrator voice. By 1943, Yamamoto had become both the architect and the prisoner of his own war. He was celebrated in public, isolated in private, and haunted by the truth he could not speak. History remembers him as a strategist, but perhaps his real legacy was that of a prophet, one doomed to lead a nation toward the disaster he had tried to prevent. If you believe that even a genius cannot change the course of a nation blinded by pride, type 1 in the comments. If you think Yamamoto still had a chance to change history, hit like. And stay with us for part 6, the final signal before death, where Yamamoto's fate meets the sky in one last message to the empire he could no longer save. April 18, 1943. The sky above the Solomon Islands was perfectly clear, a deceptive calm that hid the deadliest kind of trap. At dawn, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber on Bougainville, surrounded by the familiar ritual of military precision. Officers saluted. Engines roared to life. Everything seemed orderly, normal, inevitable. He had insisted on the trip himself, a morale inspection for the frontline troops fighting in the jungle. His staff had protested. Intelligence hinted that the Americans were improving their code-breaking, that his itinerary might be exposed. But Yamamoto refused to cancel. If a commander fears death, he said, how can he ask others to face it? The words were steady, but those close to him noticed something in his voice that morning. A strange calmness, as though he already knew the end had been written. The G4M lifted off the runway at 6:00 a.m., its engines vibrating through the tropical air. A second bomber followed behind, carrying his chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki. As the coastline fell away beneath them, Yamamoto looked down at the endless blue expanse of the Pacific. The ocean that had once been his battlefield now looked like a mirror, cold and indifferent. On the ground, his final message had already been transmitted to Tokyo. It was short, almost cryptic, "Prepare for the world after defeat." His staff later dismissed it as a mistranslation. But Watanabe, who had helped encode it, swore it was deliberate. Yamamoto had chosen those words carefully, a farewell disguised as foresight. What neither he nor his men knew was that thousands of miles away in a darkened radio room on Guadalcanal, American intelligence officers were already reading his schedule. The U.S. Navy's cryptologists had broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code months earlier. His route, altitude, and exact arrival time were known down to the minute. The operation to intercept him had a single name: vengeance. 18P-38. Lightning fighters from the 339th Fighter Squadron took off from Guadalcanal at 7:25 a.m., flying at treetop level to avoid radar detection. They carried extra fuel tanks and one mission to find and destroy the plane carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had masterminded Pearl Harbor. The flight plan was so exacting that each pilot had been told, "If you are 1 minute late, you will miss him. If you are 1 minute early, you will die." At 9:34 a.m., Yamamoto's navigator spotted something on the horizon, dark specks moving fast and low. "American fighters," someone shouted. The bomber crew snapped to action. The Bettys were fast but fragile flying coffins of thin aluminum. The escorting Japanese Zeros turned to intercept, but they were outnumbered and outclimbed. Inside the lead bomber, Yamamoto remained calm. Witnesses later said he was leaning forward, his gloved hands resting lightly on the edge of his seat as if studying the enemy one last time. The P-38S approached from below the clouds. Captain Thomas Lanphier, leading the attack, banked sharply and dove. The first burst of .50 caliber fire ripped through the bomber's right engine, sending smoke trailing behind. Another American pilot, Rex Barber, came in from the opposite side and fired a full burst into the fuselage. The plane shuddered violently. For a moment, the crew thought they might make it. The co-pilot tried to climb, but the left wing tore free. The G-4M rolled onto its side, descended through the trees, and exploded in a pillar of flame deep within the jungle. The second bomber was also hit, but managed to escape. Hours later, when Japanese search teams reached the crash site, they found the wreckage scattered across the forest floor. The air smelled of fuel and burned bamboo. Yamamoto's body was still seated upright, his hand resting on his sword, his face calm. He had died instantly, a bullet through the heart. The forest around him was silent except for the crackle of cooling metal. The news of his death was kept secret for nearly a month. When it was finally announced, Japan went into mourning. Newspapers called him a fallen hero of destiny. The government declared a day of national grief. But among his closest aides, grief was mixed with something colder relief. Yamamoto's death had spared them from the unbearable truth he carried. On the American side, the mission was hailed as justice. The pilots who carried it out returned to base with silent satisfaction. There were no cheers, no celebration, only exhaustion. They had done their duty. But even they later admitted a strange sense of respect for the man they had killed. He fought with honor, one said. He just fought for the wrong future. At Truk Lagoon, Watanabe received the telegram confirming his commander's death. He placed it gently on Yamamoto's desk, beside the map of the Pacific, still pinned with red circles. For a long time he did not move. Then, almost unconsciously, he whispered, "You knew." Narrator voice Operation Vengeance achieved what no battle had: the precise removal of Japan's greatest mind. But in killing Yamamoto, the Americans also ended the last voice within Japan that truly understood them. The Admiral's final signal had not been a prophecy, it was a confession. He had seen the end, and he had faced it without fear. If you believe Yamamoto's death marked not just the loss of a man, but the moment Japan lost its reason, type 1 in the comments. If you think his fate was inevitable from the moment Pearl Harbor was struck, hit like. And don't miss Part 7, The Legacy of a Man Who Understood Too Late, where we uncover how Yamamoto's warnings still echo through every war that follows. In the summer of 1945, 2 years after Yamamoto's death, Japan lay in ruins. The cities that had once glittered under imperial banners were now silent landscapes of ash. Factories stood, gutted railways twisted, and skies that once carried the pride of the rising sun now echoed only with the roar of American bombers. The prophecy Yamamoto had seen from his cabin window at Truk Lagoon had come true in every terrible detail. The empire he served had collapsed not through defeat on the battlefield, but through exhaustion of its soul. After the war, American occupation officers discovered his private papers and letters. Among them was a note written weeks before his death. In it, he had scrawled in English, "The real art of war is knowing when not to fight." The words were brief, almost casual, but they captured the essence of his tragedy. He had been a man who understood everything, except how to stop what he had begun. In post-war Japan, his name became a paradox, half legend, half warning. To the older generation, he was a hero, a symbol of duty and precision, the admiral who gave Japan its moment of triumph. But to the younger generation growing up among ruins, Yamamoto became something else, a mirror reflecting the price of pride. Students studied his strategy at Pearl Harbor, but professors quoted his Harvard years instead, reminding them that the man who struck America was also the one who once admired it. When American historians examined his life, they found a complexity rare among wartime leaders. They saw a man who had grasped the future, yet was trapped by the past, who could calculate every probability of war except the blindness of his own government. The same intelligence that made him formidable as a strategist made him tragic as a human being. By the 1960s, Japanese filmmakers began to portray Yamamoto not as the enemy of America, but as the victim of inevitability, a leader crushed between obedience and foresight. His voice, recreated through diaries and testimonies, became a quiet lesson that echoed far beyond his time, that in an age of machines, courage alone is no longer enough. Today his name is engraved at Gifu Air Base and memorialized at his birthplace in Nagaoka. American naval cadets still study his tactics, and Japanese officers still quote his warnings. But perhaps his greatest legacy lies not in the battles he fought, nor the ships he commanded, but in the realization that modern war is not a contest of heroes. It is a contest of systems, of minds, of consequences. Narrator voice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto died believing he had attacked the wrong enemy. In truth, he had attacked the future, a future where war would no longer be decided by honor but by calculation. And in that war, he was the first casualty. If you believe Yamamoto's story is more than history, that it's a warning for every generation that confuses power with wisdom, type 1 in the comments. If you think some lessons are only learned in defeat, hit like. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the human truths behind history's darkest hours. January 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but for 300 German prisoners of war held deep in the American Midwest, the battle for survival had just begun. In a remote Kansas plain where the winter wind could slice through wood and bone alike, the thermometer had plunged below zero. Inside the wooden barracks of Camp Concordia, men huddled under thin wool blankets, their breath turning to frost before it reached the air. The war was over for them, yet men were dying not from bullets or bombs, but from the silent cold of America's heartland. That night, the first 3 bodies were found at dawn frozen in their bunks. The U.S. guards themselves, wrapped in heavy parkas, watched helplessly as the camp's main boiler failed completely. Pipes cracked like rifle shots under the ice valves burst, and the last traces of heat vanished into the snow. The military engineers in charge had no replacement parts and no spare pipes. Supply lines were frozen too. The war effort prioritized ammunition and transport, not heat for captured enemies. The official report called it an unavoidable mechanical failure. But inside the wire, 300 men now faced a slow, freezing death. Among them was a prisoner who refused to accept that fate. His name was Friedrich Keller, a 38-year-old mechanic from Dresden, captured in North Africa and shipped across the Atlantic 2 years earlier. He was no officer, no hero, just a railway mechanic who understood metal the way other men understood language. To him, every pipe, every joint, every leak had a story. And when the heat died, he saw something no one else did, a way to bring it back. Outside the camp's warehouse lay a junkyard, discarded oil drums, rusted truck exhausts, broken valves, and old copper wire. To the Americans, it was garbage. To Keller, it was possibility. He approached the guard that morning, his breath turning white as he spoke. "I can fix the heat," he said in broken English. "I just need the junk behind the warehouse." The guard laughed, thinking it was another desperate prisoner's fantasy. A man armed with scrap metal could not rebuild an army boiler in the middle of a Kansas blizzard. But Keller persisted. That night, while the snow fell in sheets against the barbed wire, he began sketching in the frost on the wall of his barrack. Other prisoners gathered around watching as he drew circles, arrows, and strange connections no one understood. He explained that if they could link the barracks using improvised ducts, and if they could capture exhaust heat from the trucks parked near the fence, they might push warm air through the huts again. It was madness, but madness was better than waiting to die. At 4 a.m., Keller stood outside, shivering but determined, pointing at the junk pile through the wire. "That's our coal," he told the others. "That's our steel. That's our chance." One guard finally relented, allowing him and 2 prisoners to gather what they could before dawn. They dragged the frozen metal back through the snow hands raw and bleeding. Every clang echoed across the empty field like the heartbeat of a dying engine trying to start again. No one in the camp believed it would work. Even the American lieutenant in charge, a young officer named Andrews, wrote in his logbook, "Prisoner insists on building makeshift heating from scrap. Permission granted, no expectations." Yet history would prove him wrong. What began as a desperate act of survival would become one of the most remarkable engineering stories of World War II, a forgotten episode where ingenuity, courage, and the will to live turned waste into warmth and enemies into collaborators. Before the first flame was lit, the camp stood on the edge of tragedy. For the prisoners, Keller's plan was their final hope. For the Americans, it was a test of trust. Could a German mechanic really rebuild an entire heating system out of junkyard scrap in sub-zero temperatures before another man froze to death? If you believe one man's hands could save 300 lives with nothing but discarded metal, type 1 in the comments. But if you think no amount of ingenuity could stop that kind of cold, hit the like button. And remember to subscribe, because what happens next will change how you think about survival engineering and humanity in the middle of war. Camp Concordia lay in the flat heart of Kansas, surrounded by endless fields of frozen wheat stubble and the low moan of the wind. Built hastily in 1943 to house captured Germans from North Africa. It stretched across nearly 800 acres, rows of identical wooden barracks, barbed wire fences, and watchtowers where American guards stood motionless against the pale horizon. From the air, it looked like order. On the ground, it was isolation. By January 1945, the war in Europe was burning itself out, but here the cold was the real enemy. Inside each barrack, 50 men slept shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in thin army blankets. The wood stoves meant to warm the huts had long since gone silent. Frost crawled across the inside walls, coating everything, bunks, boots, even the men's eyelashes, with a brittle film of ice. Buckets of water froze solid overnight. In the mornings, prisoners used sticks to chip the ice out of their wash basins. At night, the temperature dropped to -15 Fahrenheit. Wind roared through gaps in the walls, making the barracks creak like ships at sea. Some men stuffed straw into the cracks to block the drafts. Others slept with their shoes on, afraid their toes would freeze before morning. Every breath turned white, lingering in the air before vanishing like ghosts of the front lines they had left behind. For the Americans, it was misery of another kind. The guards had wool coats and kerosene heaters in their huts, but they could do little for the prisoners. Fuel rations were strict. Replacement parts for the camp's main boiler were hundreds of miles away, delayed by snow-choked railroads and the endless demands of wartime supply. Headquarters had issued a single order, maintain order, await replacement system. But order was fragile. The camp housed nearly 4,000 prisoners, former tank crews, Luftwaffe mechanics, Afrika Korps engineers, and a few who had once been civilians like Keller. Many of them were veterans of desert campaigns, unprepared for the endless gray cold of the Midwest. They tried to endure it with stoic silence, but hunger and frost wore away even discipline. One man's cough spread through the barracks like an omen. Reports from other camps told similar stories. In Iowa, 10 prisoners had died in a single week when a storm froze the camp's plumbing. In Nebraska, guards had resorted to burning fence posts to keep their own quarters warm. The war's logistics had forgotten these men that captured the unseen, the ones who were supposed to be safe now that the fighting was over. Inside Camp Concordia, the tension was visible. Each morning, American medics walked the rows of bunks checking for the living. They recorded temperatures, counted the sick, and dragged out those who had not moved. The guards avoided eye contact as stretchers passed by. Nobody wanted to admit that men could freeze to death on American soil. The officers debated whether to evacuate part of the camp, but moving hundreds of prisoners through snowbound roads was impossible. So they waited for shipments that never came, for parts that wouldn't arrive for the weather to break. The prisoners waited too, wrapped in their coats, whispering in German about rumors of spring that never seemed to come. Then, amid the silence of one wind-battered afternoon, the faint clatter of metal echoed from behind the storage sheds. It was Keller again, sorting through the junkyard the Americans had long forgotten. He worked with a strange intensity, stacking pipes by size, tapping each with his knuckles, listening to the pitch. Other prisoners joined him, curious. Soon a small group was bending, hammering, and cleaning rust off scrap steel with rags. The guards looked on warily, but the scene had an odd calm about it. Prisoners who had been silent for days now argued in low voices over pipe fittings. A camp that had been dying by inches began for the first time in weeks to move with purpose. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. By nightfall, a pile of scavenged metal stood beside the barracks' exhaust pipes, broken stove parts, oil drums, and bent sheet iron. Keller crouched beside it, drawing lines in the snow, explaining something in slow, halting English to a young American corporal. "Hot air from here," he said, pointing to the sketch through pipe. "Here, here. No freeze." The corporal frowned, then nodded. "You mean from the trucks?" Keller smiled weakly. "From anything that burns?" That night, as the wind howled through the empty fields, a strange optimism crept through the camp. Men who had lost hope now whispered about the machine, as they called it. They had no idea if it would work. But for the first time, the conversation wasn't about who had died. It was about what might be built. The Americans watched them work in the cold and saw something unexpected: discipline, cooperation, and the same stubborn will that had once fueled their enemy's war machine now turned toward survival under American skies. In a way, it was unsettling. But Lieutenant Andrews, the officer in charge, saw it differently. "If they can keep themselves alive," he wrote in his daily report, "maybe we can all learn something about ingenuity." The next morning, smoke rose above the junkyard for the first time, thin and gray against the pale Kansas sky. The prisoners were building something, and no one yet knew whether it would save them or destroy what little warmth they had left. If you think these men deserve the chance to try Type 1 in the comments, if you believe they should have been left to the fate of war's aftermath, tap like instead. And if you want to know what happened when that first pipe filled with heat, stay until the next chapter, because that's when the miracle began. Friedrich Keller had never seen himself as an inventor. He was a mechanic, a man who fixed what was broken and left no fingerprints on history. Before the war, he worked in a railway workshop outside Dresden, repairing steam locomotives for the Deutsche Reichsbahn. His days were filled with the smell of hot iron, the hiss of pressure valves, and the rhythm of engines breathing under his hands. He knew metal the way farmers knew soil, its moods, its limits, the sounds it made before it failed. That instinct, born from years spent tightening bolts and sealing pipes, would become the only weapon he had in a place where even the air could kill. In Camp Concordia, that instinct came alive again. When the main boiler failed, Keller spent nights tracing its piping system in his mind, remembering how heat flowed through engines and how pressure could be tamed with nothing but patience and balance. The Americans had used industrial steam systems similar to those on old locomotives. To him, the logic was simple: if the engine of a train could stay warm across the frozen plains of Europe, a barrack could too if someone knew how to rebuild its heart. The junkyard behind the camp was a graveyard of machines. Old fuel drums half buried in snow truck mufflers from broken jeeps, rusted sheet metal, and a tangled heap of copper wire stripped from generators. To most, it was worthless debris. To Keller, it was a library. He walked among the piles, touching each object like a page, weighing it in his hands, imagining how it might fit together. A muffler became a pressure pipe. A steel drum became a boiler chamber. Bent copper wire became a conductor for a makeshift thermostat. The cold numbed his fingers, but his mind burned with calculations. He started alone. Then, one night, another prisoner, Hans Meyer, a young electrician from Hamburg, joined him silently. Then two more, both mechanics from Rommel's Africa Corps. Within days, a small team had formed around Keller, working under the dim light of a single kerosene lantern. They cleaned the rusted pipes with sand-sealed cracks with a paste of mud and grease, and hammered old engine parts into new shapes. The sound of tools returned to the camp like the faint heartbeat of civilization itself. Every evening, Keller drew in the snow behind the barracks, sketching the system again and again. His idea was deceptively simple: to create a network of exhaust-driven heat exchangers using truck engines as forced air furnaces. The camp had several decommissioned transport trucks parked near the fence. Their engines, when idled, produced enormous heat. If that heat could be captured, pushed through the pipes, and distributed across the barracks, it might keep the men alive. The key was not power, it was control. Too much heat, and the pipes would burst. Too little, and the system would fail. Lieutenant Andrews allowed him to continue, though he doubted it would work. But something about Keller's quiet focus impressed him. "The man doesn't waste words," Andrews wrote in his log. "He just looks at the metal like he's listening to it." The Americans watched as Keller and his team dragged the first components across the snow. They worked without gloves, because gloves made them clumsy. Their hands turning red and cracked from the cold, they built crude frames to hold the pipes, propping them on bricks and boards scavenged from broken fences. When the guards complained about missing lumber, Andrews told them to stand down. "Let them work," he said. "It's the only thing keeping them alive." Inside the barracks, hope spread faster than warmth. Men who had spent weeks silent now gathered to help, passing tools, offering rags melting snow for water to clean the fittings. For the first time since capture, they had purpose. Even the Americans began to assist, quietly lending spare bolts and fuel oil. War lines blurred in the face of necessity. The camp became a workshop. At night, Keller would sit near the junk pile, studying his hands in the lantern glow. The skin was torn nails, blackened knuckles, swollen, but he smiled faintly. In those hands he carried the weight of 300 lives and a lifetime of mechanical memory. He remembered his father's words spoken long before the war: "A good mechanic doesn't need new parts, only a clear head." That mantra guided him as he rebuilt each piece from fragments. A broken muffler became a connector. A fuel drum lid turned into a pressure cap. He wrapped every joint with strips of canvas soaked in grease to stop leaks. Improvised tools replaced missing wrenches, hammerheads tied to sticks, nails sharpened into chisels. By the fourth night, the system began to take shape. The main heat chamber sat behind the barracks, shielded from the wind by stacked crates. Pipes snaked out across the snow like frozen veins, leading to the huts where the men slept. Inside, Keller positioned the end of each pipe beneath a crude vent made from tin cans so the hot air could rise evenly. He calculated every distance, every angle, by feel and intuition. There were no gauges, no thermometers, only the sound of metal expanding when heat touched it. When the first engine started, the ground trembled. Exhaust fumes filled the air thick and acrid as the system roared to life. Steam hissed through the pipes, spitting black water and rust. Keller stood in the snow face, lit by the orange glow of the firebox, watching. A faint warmth began to drift into the first barrack. The men inside felt it and started shouting. For the first time in weeks, the air was no longer deadly. Still, Keller knew it wasn't finished. The pipes rattled. Pressure was uneven. He needed to reinforce the joints before the system tore itself apart. "Not yet," he muttered in German. "She's not ready." That night he stayed awake under the stars, listening to the system breathe. The sound reminded him of the locomotives he used to repair massive machines, alive with heat and rhythm. In that moment, he wasn't a prisoner anymore. He was a mechanic again. If you believe skill and purpose can survive even inside a prison fence, type 1 in the comments. If you think war takes away more than it gives, hit like to let us know. And remember to subscribe, because what happens when the cold strikes back will test Keller's invention to its breaking point. For 2 days, Camp Concordia breathed again. The frost on the windows melted into droplets, and the prisoners felt something they had almost forgotten: warmth. It wasn't much, just a few degrees above freezing, but it was enough to turn despair into hope. Men who had stopped talking began to smile. Guards who once looked at the prisoners with suspicion now lingered near the barracks, enjoying the rising heat that drifted through cracks in the walls. Even Lieutenant Andrews, whose reports had been dry and factual, added a rare line in his daily log, "Improvised heating successful." Morale improving, but winter has a way of punishing success. On the third night, the wind turned vicious, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in a matter of hours. Keller's system strained against it. The makeshift boiler, fueled by scavenged wood and truck exhaust, glowed red from within. Pressure built faster than the pipes could release it. The recycled joints wrapped in greasy cloth began to hiss. One of the mechanics shouted for Keller. He ran through the snow toward the sound-heart, pounding boots slipping on ice. The first explosion was small, a muffled thump, followed by a cloud of steam. The second was deafening. A pipe near the second barrack burst, tearing a hole through the wall and showering the snow with fragments of metal. The prisoners scattered as boiling water sprayed across the yard. 2 men were burned, one badly. The guards rushed in, rifles raised, fearing sabotage. Keller tried to shout over the chaos, but no one listened. In minutes, the camp dissolved into confusion, prisoners yelling in German Americans, shouting in English, steam roaring between them like an angry ghost. By dawn, the system lay silent again. The fires were out. The engine stopped and the camp returned to cold. Smoke and frost mingled in the air. Keller sat beside the broken pipe, his hands black with soot and blood. Lieutenant Andrews approached slowly, his face drawn with exhaustion. "You nearly killed them," he said quietly. Keller didn't argue. "Ja," he answered. "But if we do nothing, they die anyway." The Army medics treated the burns. One prisoner would never regain the use of his right hand. The rest of the men watched as the Americans dismantled the damaged section, stacking the pipes in a neat pile, as if burying the hope that had briefly warmed them. Keller said nothing. That afternoon he was confined to his barrack under supervision, forbidden from continuing his work. That night was the coldest yet. The mercury fell below -20. The wind howled like artillery fire across the plains. Inside the unheated barracks, men lay awake shivering in silence. Every few minutes someone coughed or whispered prayers into the dark. The smell of frost and fear filled the air. Outside, Lieutenant Andrews stood by the fence watching the snow swirl around the motionless trucks. He could see the breath of the guards as pale clouds in the dark. Somewhere inside that white emptiness, he could also see Keller's shadow sitting by the broken machinery, motionless, defeated. Andrews thought about the report he would have to send. Experimental heating attempt failed. 1 injured. It was a safe report, one that would satisfy command and clear his conscience. But it didn't feel right. The truth was more complicated. The attempt had failed, yes, but it had almost worked. In those 2 brief days, Keller's system had done something extraordinary. It had saved lives. Without it, the camp would already have lost more than 3 men. At midnight, Andrews made his decision. He walked to the barrack where Keller sat awake, staring at his blistered hands. The lantern light flickered on the man's face, gaunt but steady. Andrews spoke quietly. "You get one more chance," he said. "One night. You rebuild it your way, but no more accidents." Keller's eyes widened. He nodded once. "Then I need every man," he said. Within minutes, the camp came alive again. Prisoners emerged from their bunks, moving through the snow like ghosts. Guards watched silently as men carried pipes, tools, and fuel drums back to the yard. Andrews ordered 2 trucks positioned near the main barracks engines idling. Their exhaust plumed into the night, glowing orange in the lantern light. Keller moved among the men, giving instructions in clipped phrases. His voice was firm now, his purpose clear. They worked without rest. Sheets of frost formed on their coats, melting instantly when they leaned too close to the fire. Keller reinforced every joint with double layers of cloth soaked in grease, then wrapped each with wire pulled from old generators. He replaced the broken pipe with shorter sections to reduce pressure and added small release vents holes drilled with nails to bleed steam when it rose too high. It was crude, ugly engineering, but it was brilliant. Every sound, the clank of metal, the hiss of the torch, the rumble of the truck engines, merged into a single heartbeat pulsing through the camp. At 3 a.m., Keller gave the signal. "Now," he said. Andrews turned the valve. The system shuddered, groaned, then began to hum. Warm air spilled from the vents first as vapor, then as steady heat. Frost melted from the walls. The barracks filled with the smell of iron and oil, the scent of life returning. Men laughed and cried at once, pressing their hands to the vents as if touching fire for the first time. Keller stood apart, watching the gauges he had drawn on a scrap of wood. He could tell from the pitch of the pipes that the pressure was holding. The release valves hissed gently like breathing. For the first time in weeks, he exhaled without seeing his own breath. When dawn came, the snow outside glowed pink under the rising sun. Inside the camp, the temperature had climbed to 45 degrees. No one had died that night. Not one. Andrews looked at Keller across the yard, then nodded silently. "You did it," he said. Keller shrugged. "No," he replied. "We did." That morning, the lieutenant wrote a new report, improvised heating restored. All personnel stable, no further casualties. But he added one line that would never appear in any official record: miracle achieved through cooperation of prisoners and guards. If you believe second chances can change everything, type 1 in the comments. If you think war never allows redemption, hit like to let us know. And stay tuned, because what Keller built that night would outlast every fence, every guard tower, and every winter that followed. By sunrise, the snow outside Camp Concordia had turned to steam. Thin ribbons of vapor drifted from the metal pipes, stretched between the barracks, curling into the air like ghosts of the machines they had once been. Inside, men awoke not to the sting of frozen breath, but to warmth, a gentle, steady warmth that wrapped around their bodies like a forgotten memory. For the first time in weeks, there was no coughing, no groaning, no sound of teeth chattering in the dark. Only silence, the quiet relief of 300 men, realizing they had survived the coldest night of their lives. The system Keller built that night defied logic. Even the American engineers who inspected it days later called it ridiculous. Yet it worked. Using nothing but scrap metal exhaust fumes and the desperate ingenuity of a mechanic who refused to give up, Keller had created a fully functioning heat distribution system capable of maintaining livable temperatures across multiple barracks. It was crude, noisy, and dangerous, but it saved lives, and that in the language of war made it genius. The setup was deceptively simple. 2 decommissioned Army trucks parked nose to nose acted as twin heat generators. Their engines ran at idle, burning low-octane fuel salvaged from storage drums. The exhaust from each engine was funneled through a network of makeshift ducts, pipes, scavenged from vehicle mufflers, and fuel lines leading into a large oil drum that Keller had transformed into a heat exchanger. Inside that drum, exhaust gases swirled around a secondary chamber containing water drawn from melted snow. The heat of the fumes turned the water into vapor, which was then pushed through a maze of narrow steel tubes into the barracks. At each junction, Keller had added a primitive vent made from tin cans. The cans were punched with small holes and wrapped in cloth soaked in grease to prevent leaks. When the pressure inside the system rose too high, the cans hissed softly, releasing excess steam before the pipes could burst. It was a self-regulating safety mechanism, something Keller had learned to build years before while repairing old locomotives with faulty boilers. Every inch of the system bore the marks of improvisation. The pipes were bound with wire, the joints sealed with canvas soaked in animal fat, and the valves turned with wrenches carved from frozen wood, yet somehow it functioned. Temperatures inside the main barracks climbed steadily to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, while outer buildings held at just above freezing enough to prevent frostbite enough to keep men alive. When Lieutenant Andrews sent word of the success to his superiors, they refused to believe it. No functioning heat system could be built from junk, one engineer replied in disbelief. But when a technical officer arrived from Fort Riley 3 days later to inspect it, he stood in stunned silence as Keller demonstrated the system. The officer touched the metal pipe. It was warm. He followed it through the barrack wall and out into the yard, tracing the snaking line that connected to the roaring truck engines. "This shouldn't work," he muttered. Keller smiled. "And yet it does. The officer spent the next 2 hours sketching the design, taking notes on the flow pattern and pressure balance. His final report to the Corps of Engineers was short but unforgettable. Improvised steam system demonstrates functional integrity under extreme cold. Recommend further study for field adaptation. That note would later circulate quietly through military engineering circles. No medals, no public recognition, just a line in an internal document titled Emergency Heat Distributions Experiments, Winter, 1945. It mentioned no names, but those who knew the story at Camp Concordia remembered the man who built it. In the weeks that followed, the system became a permanent fixture. The camp's official heating equipment arrived too late to matter. By then, Keller's invention had proven more reliable than the original design. The Americans continued to supply fuel for the trucks, and in exchange the prisoners maintained the system. Every morning, Keller's small team inspected the pipes, tightened joints, and cleared the exhaust lines of soot. Under the bitter Kansas sky, something extraordinary had happened. Enemies had become collaborators, bound not by ideology, but by the shared understanding that survival depended on the same fire. The guards stopped calling them Krauts and began calling them the engineers. Andrews stopped writing prisoners in his daily logs. Instead, he wrote crew. In February, a journalist from the Concordia Blade Empire visited the camp after hearing rumors of the German boiler miracle. The reporter described seeing pipes made from car parts and fence wire and smoke rising from a contraption that looked more like a sculpture than a machine. The article never reached national circulation. Wartime censorship saw to that, but a single photograph survived Keller standing beside his makeshift boiler coat, buttoned to his neck, eyes squinting against the steam. Behind him, the barracks glowed faintly with warmth. As spring approached, the system was finally shut down. The snow melted, the trucks cooled, and the camp returned to its monotonous rhythm of roll calls and work details. But the story did not end there. Andrews kept Keller's blueprints drawn crudely on the back of ration box cardboard and forwarded them to an engineering officer studying field heating for U.S. outposts in Alaska. In 1946, the U.S. Army tested a mobile exhaust heat transfer system for Arctic installations based in part on that sketch. The official patent for a low-fuel field steam generator would later bear an American engineer's name, but the design was unmistakably Keller's. For the men who had lived through that winter, none of that mattered. What they remembered was the moment when the vents first breathed warm air, and the silence that followed, a silence so heavy that even the guards had tears in their eyes. Some of those men would later write letters home, describing it as the night we learned that machines can save souls. Years later, after the war, when Camp Concordia was dismantled and the land returned to wheat, farmers' fragments of Keller's system were found buried in the soil sections of pipe, a rusted oil drum, the remnants of a vent made from tin cans. Archaeologists cataloged them as industrial waste. But in the town's historical society records a handwritten note from a former guard tells the real story. That junk kept 300 men alive. Never forget the man who made it work. Friedrich Keller returned to Germany in 1946. Dresden was gone destroyed by firebombing. He found work at Siemens designing pressure control systems for industrial heating. When his colleagues marveled at his precision, he would smile quietly and say only, "You learn quickly when the cold wants to kill you." He never spoke publicly about Camp Concordia. But in 1951, the company introduced a new portable steam generator for construction sites, compact, efficient, and remarkably similar to the machine Keller had once built from scrap. By then, the world had forgotten the winter of 1945, the Kansas snow, and the sound of those truck engines idling through the night. But the principle, he proved that necessity and compassion can forge miracles from waste lived on and in every blueprint that bore his touch. Even today, engineers studying post-war heating systems cite the Concordia method without knowing its true origin. The story remains buried in classified reports and fading memories, but the lesson endures. Sometimes the simplest machines built in desperation carry the deepest humanity. If you believe brilliance can be born from the lowest place, type 1 in the comments. If you think history too often forgets its quiet heroes, hit like to let us know. And subscribe, because in the next chapter, the war ends, but Keller's invention finds a second life that will reach all the way to the frozen edges of Alaska. When spring came to Kansas in 1945, the fences around Camp Concordia began to lose their menace. Snow melted into mud, the air softened, and the men who had spent months fighting the cold stepped outside to watch the prairie turn green again. The boiler Keller built was no longer needed, but no one wanted to take it apart. Even the guards walked past it quietly, as though disturbing it might invite the winter back. The machine stood there like a monument, rusted, patched, ugly, but alive. In May, the war in Europe officially ended. The camp commander gathered the prisoners in the yard to read the announcement. Some cheered, others wept. Keller simply stood still. The victory he cared about had already been won months earlier, when 300 men survived what should have been their last winter. That night, the barracks glowed with small lanterns, as prisoners shared their final rations, trading cigarettes for stories. The war that had divided them now felt distant, drowned out by the hum of insects and the soft rustle of spring wind through the fields. Within weeks, the repatriation process began. Thousands of German POWs across the United States were scheduled for return to Europe. Many left behind letters, carvings, or small wooden toys they had made in the camps. Keller left something else, blueprints. Before he boarded the transport train, he handed a folder of sketches to Lieutenant Andrews. "For your engineers," he said quietly. "Maybe it helps someone next winter." Andrews nodded, taking the papers as if they were made of glass. "You already did," he replied. The documents made their way through the chain of command until they reached a technical division at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. There, engineers studying field logistics for Arctic operations examined the Concordia drawings. Though crude, they showed a deep understanding of thermodynamics. The concept using vehicle exhaust to heat enclosed spaces through a passive vapor system was unlike anything officially documented at the time. The file was marked "Experimental Retained for Reference." That reference soon proved valuable. In 1946, as American troops established bases in Alaska and northern Canada, they faced the same deadly problem Keller had faced in Kansas. Equipment freezing, men suffering in sub-zero temperatures, supply chains too long to deliver spare parts. The Army Corps of Engineers initiated Operation Frostbite, a series of cold weather experiments aimed at developing portable heating solutions. Among the methods tested was a truck exhaust-to-boiler conversion identical in principle to Keller's system. It performed flawlessly in the field. By 1948, the U.S. Army had officially adopted a compact version of the design for remote construction camps. The report credited unknown field engineers Weddlewood II, never naming Keller or even Camp Concordia. But deep in the technical appendices, a small note appeared based on POW field modifications observed 1945 Kansas sector. It was the only acknowledgement he would ever receive. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Keller returned to a country that no longer resembled the one he had left. Dresden was a graveyard of ash and twisted metal. Factories lay in ruins, railways torn apart. He found work rebuilding boiler systems for what remained of the city's infrastructure. It was quiet, unglamorous work, but he didn't mind. In the evenings, he tinkered with small prototypes, portable heaters made from scrap, and water pipes designed to run on minimal fuel. When neighbors asked what he was building, he would smile and say, "Something that remembers." In 1949, Siemens hired him as a technical consultant. His expertise in steam systems and pressure control impressed the post-war engineers trying to rebuild Germany's energy grid. In his personnel file, a manager described him as a man of modest words but extraordinary understanding of machinery. None of them knew that the design principles Keller taught them balanced pressure. Modular piping exhaust heat recovery had first been forged in a Kansas prison yard. That same year, a delegation from the U.S. Army visited Siemens to study industrial heating systems. They toured Keller's workshop without realizing they were speaking to the man whose ridiculous invention had once kept 300 POWs alive. He shook their hands politely, said little, and watched them leave with quiet amusement. He never mentioned Camp Concordia. Decades later, historians would uncover fragments of the story. A 1983 thesis from the University of Kansas cited interviews with former guards who remembered a German mechanic named Keller who built a heating system out of truck parts. Another local newspaper article from 1987 mentioned the miracle winter of the POW camp, describing how prisoners and guards worked side by side to fight the cold. The article quoted an aging Andrews, by then a retired engineer, who said, "It wasn't about the pipes or the trucks. It was about faith in a man you were supposed to hate but couldn't." Keller died in 1968 in Dresden. His death notice listed him simply as Maschinenschlosser, machine locksmith. There was no mention of Camp Concordia, no medals, no tributes. But in a letter found among his papers after his death, written in careful English, he addressed an old friend in America, "We were enemies once, but in that winter we shared the same fire. If machines can bring warmth, maybe men can too." The letter ended with a sketch, two hands joined across a fence made of wire. Today the site of Camp Concordia is farmland again. Only a single guard tower remains restored by local historians. Near it, a small bronze plaque reads, "In memory of the men who lived, worked, and endured here, 1943-1945. It says nothing about the boiler, the mechanic, or the night the camp was saved by a machine built from junk. But if you stand there on a winter morning when the frost covers the ground and your breath hangs in the air, you can almost hear it, the faint hum of an engine, the whisper of pipes breathing warmth into the cold. If you believe that innovation and compassion can outlast any war type, one in the comments. If you think the greatest victories are the ones history forgets, hit like to let us know. And subscribe, because in the final chapter, you'll see how Keller's forgotten design quietly shaped the technology that would heat the coldest places on Earth. In the years that followed, the world built monuments to its heroes, bronze statues of generals, marble walls of names, flags that waved over graves. But no one ever built a monument for Friedrich Keller. His memorial existed only in the quiet warmth that spread from his hands to the men he saved, and in the machines that carried his ideas long after he was gone. Every engineer who learned to recycle heat, every mechanic who found use in a pile of scrap, every soldier who huddled around a heater in some frozen outpost, they were all living echoes of that winter in Kansas. By the 1950s, the technology Keller had inspired was everywhere. Oilfield workers in Alaska used exhaust-driven heating units to warm their rigs. Arctic research stations borrowed his principle of circulating heat through small ducts powered by truck engines. Even the early space program adopted variations of the same system to keep spacecraft components from freezing during testing. The language of patents and manuals never mentioned a name, but the fingerprints were unmistakable balance of pressure use, of waste heat-controlled exhaust, and safety release vents. The very ideas Keller had drawn in the snow with his bare hands. But perhaps the most enduring legacy wasn't mechanical at all, it was human. During the Cold War, when nations once again divided the world with fences and fear the story of the German mechanic circulated quietly among American engineers and officers who remembered him. They told it as a parable that cooperation could exist even behind barbed wire, that ingenuity had no flag, and that sometimes the smallest act of compassion could change the shape of survival. In 1992, long after the last of the prisoners and guards had passed away, the Concordia Historical Society opened a small exhibition titled "The Winter That Machines Saved Men." Among the rusted tools and black and white photos was a single artifact, a bent length of steel pipe sealed at one end with layers of cloth and wire. A tag beneath it read simply, "Recovered from former POW camp 1945, believed to be part of improvised heating system." Visitors rarely noticed it at first. It didn't shine. It didn't look important. But when the curator explained that this piece of scrap had carried the warmth that saved hundreds of lives, they often fell silent. It is said that history remembers wars through victories and losses, but rarely through the moments in between the moments when survival depended not on who fired first, but on who chose to fix something broken. Keller's invention was never about the machine. It was about the decision to build when destruction was all the world had taught him. On cold mornings in Kansas, the frost still creeps across the prairie. And sometimes, if the wind is just right, you can almost imagine the faint sound of a truck engine idling somewhere far away, a heartbeat from another time when a man who was supposed to be an enemy turned a junkyard into a furnace and a prison into a place of warmth. If you believe that even in war humanity can build instead of destroy, type 1 in the comments. If you think this story deserves to be remembered, hit like so more people can find it. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories from the hidden corners of World War II, where ordinary hands changed history in extraordinary ways.